Salacious History discusses sex, romance, and many other topics that are intended for a mature audience. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Salacious History, the podcast that explores moments in history that were shaped by sex, romance, and people who were generally down to clown. I'm your host, Sarah Duncan. On today's episode, we take a walk down the aisle and learn a little bit about sex and marriage during the Tudor period in England. When and why did people get married? How was marriage different for royals versus poorer citizens? How much influence did the church have on their congregation's sex lives? Hint, way too much. All of these questions will be answered in today's podcast. Here we go. The Tudor period refers to the time span between 1485 and 1603 in England and Wales. This period also includes the Elizabethan era during the reign of Elizabeth I until 1603. The Tudor period represents the time period when the Tudor family ruled Great Britain, beginning with Henry VII, and is said to be one of the most economically healthy and prosperous times in British history. The latter years of the Tudor period also coincided with the height of the English Renaissance. As was the case with the Italian Renaissance 1 century earlier, this was a time when poetry, music, and literature flourished. One of the most famous artists to emerge during this era was playwright William Shakespeare. The Tudor period is also heavily associated with the Protestant Reformation. Henry VIII and his second wife Anne Boleyn have become symbols of the Protestant Reformation in England due to the role their marriage played in ushering the Protestant tradition into the country. We will do a deeper dive on the relationship between the Protestant Reformation and the British monarchy in a future episode. In 16th century England, sex outside of marriage was pretty widespread. However, both Christian beliefs and general social protocol at the time publicly stipulated that sexual intercourse was only appropriate between a husband and wife. The legal minimum age for marriage was 12 for girls and 14 for boys. Among the working class, it was more common for couples to marry in their 20s after the male had earned sufficient money to set up a home. The higher a person was on the social ladder, the earlier they tended to marry. It was not unheard of for royal or noble women to marry in their early teens. However, even though 12 and 14 were the legal age for marriage, there were concerns that this was too young for a couple to consummate the marriage. There were even cases where married couples were not permitted to live together until they reached a certain age. Some sources say that age 16 was generally considered appropriate for a wife to begin bearing children. Unfortunately, younger mothers were not uncommon in the upper strata of society. There were plenty of cases of 12 and 13-year-olds giving birth to children. Well-to-do families would often begin planning marriages for their heirs when they were very young. For example, the marriage of Prince Arthur and Catherine of Aragon was arranged between their parents when Arthur was just 2 and Catherine 3. Their wedding took place 12 years later when they were in their mid-teens. Arranged marriages were often more based on the needs and desires of the parents, rather than how the couple was expected to get along together. Strategically arranged marriages could be used to increase a family's wealth or political standing. And, for royal marriages, they were used to forge foreign alliances. This is a rare instance where poorer individuals had more freedom and choice than those with wealth and status. Customs of courtship and marriage underwent significant shifts during the Tudor period. As stated earlier, money, class, or political alliances predominantly determined who a person's spouse would be. But as the European continent began to modernize, many groups began to adopt the unorthodox idea of marriage based on mutual attraction and love. Many of Shakespeare's plays captured the conflicting ideas of the old order, i.e., fathers choosing husbands for their daughters, and the new order, daughters who desired to choose their own husbands based on mutual affection. With new importance placed on mutual attraction, men and women were suddenly concerned about the proper ways to woo a potential mate. It's almost impossible to discuss sex and marriage during 16th century England without also talking about religion. The church played a major role in sex and the perception of the female body. Religious messages on marriage, sex, and the roles of men and women were conveyed through sermons as well as images and paintings. Due to the story of Adam and Eve, women were seen as inferior versions of men and were thought to be much more susceptible to the devil and their base desires. The church taught that women's bodies ran hot, thus they always wanted sex. There was a great deal of humor in medieval times about unsatisfied wives running after younger men, such as in Chaucer's writings. Sex within marriage was seen as the only way to control a woman's desires. According to the church, sex was only condoned for married couples and only for the purposes of reproduction. Womp womp. Even when sex was confined to marriage, there were still a lot of mixed messages floating around. 16th century doctors considered abstinence to be bad for the health of both men and women, and encouraged couples to have sex on a regular basis. On the other hand, extreme Christians considered, quote, excessive sexual activity within marriage, unquote, to be sinful, with the husband treating his wife as little more than a prostitute. The church also put limitations on which days spouses could have sex. Sex was deemed inappropriate on feast days, fast days, saints' days, Easter week, Sundays, Wednesdays, Saturdays, anytime a woman was menstruating or pregnant, the 40 days after giving birth, and while a woman was breastfeeding. Holy shit, I'm pretty sure this leaves you with about 2 days out of the calendar year when sex is permissible. So you can see the predicament this left couples in. Long periods of abstinence were supposed to be bad for your health. But if your wife was pregnant or breastfeeding, how were you supposed to continue to be sexually active without being unfaithful to your spouse? I'm happy to say there is no evidence that most people, other than the devoutly religious or those trying to avoid an undesirable spouse, paid any attention to these limitations. The one exception was likely the 40 days after giving birth.